Okay, so good evening, everybody. Welcome to our 18th chapter of our journey through Jewish history. Today's obviously going to be a little bit different than our typical classes. One, because we're going to be focusing on a singular event, which also, of course, comes with somber undertones, as we're going to be talking about the Shoah. So one of the things that I wanted to do, and just like always, it's so tough figuring out what sources and what to actually talk about. And so I wanted to be upfront at the outset because we're in an interesting time, I think, just sociologically in the educational community, where obviously the next generation, certainly of American Jews or even just Americans in general growing up, will probably never have the chance to hear firsthand accounts. And so we're really entering into sort of a post-survivor generation, and certainly the next generation, my future children, of course, my future grandchildren, all of those generations. And so Holocaust education is really at a really interesting pivot point where it is transitioning over from being firsthand accounts and told stories and people that are connected because of either themselves or their parents, all the way to stories of grandparents or in some cases great-grandparents. And this, of course, comes with a lot of potential difficult educational choices, of course, right? It's a lot harder to empathize with something if you don't have a firsthand account, if you're sort of hearing from it from historical books. And just one example, one way in which I oftentimes think about this in terms of the difficulty of the question of continued Holocaust education is the Crusades and the subsequent expulsion from Spain, which we spent plenty of time talking about, was for its time an event that was as momentous as the Holocaust and the Shoah. And it is certainly, if we read Keynote and Lamentations and all of these texts that were written about these periods, you can sort of read into it the same undertones, especially when you read a lot of survivor accounts. Yet a lot of us, and I'll just speak for myself, I often relate to the expulsion from Spain as a tragic historic event, but really a historic event. And the Holocaust, I really think, in my life growing up, I have had the opportunities to hear firsthand accounts and to visit museums and all these things. I relate to the Shoah a lot more in sort of a disposition of memory. And we spent a lot of time talking the first week about the difference between history and memory. And what I mean by that, and hopefully that's something that a lot of people here can identify with to some extent also, is whenever I'm reading about the Holocaust or watching videos or talking about it or hearing firsthand accounts, I'm really not relating to this as dates in a history book or events. I really am viewing it almost the way in which we just celebrated Passover, the way in which the Passover Seder and the Haggadah tries to inspire us to do, which is not read this as some ancient story, but read this as now. And one of, I think, the important changes of direction that Holocaust education is going to have to go in the next generation or two is how do we take this historic event and incorporate it into memory? Memory, of course, of those in the Jewish community and also those in the wider community, because one of the, again, quite sad and scary statistics is when you actually look at, for the average public in America, of how many people have heard of the Holocaust, how many people can tell you what Auschwitz is, how many people have any sort of an idea of the magnitude of atrocity, what happened, the numbers are shockingly low. And so it really is a problem, of course, of how to continue education, how to not make the Holocaust something that, 10th or 11th graders read about for a couple of weeks to study for the AP classes or things like that, but then it sort of gets swept to the dustbin of history, right? How do we really keep the Holocaust alive as memory, both in the Jewish community and beyond? And so because of that sort of educational angle, we will talk a little bit about the history because I think the history is important. I'm also going to suspect quite a high or at least a medium level of knowledge of the germane history of the Holocaust for people here. And also just one more thing I'll say about educational approaches, because I spent a lot of time especially thinking about how to do education about anti-Semitism. And one of the things in which I've really noticed about myself, and I'm just being transparent here, is my style really switches depending on who the audience is. And so if I'm teaching a bunch of undergrads in college and most of them aren't Jewish, this class would look very different than a situation where everybody here has high familiarity, right? I won't shock anybody by talking about the Nuremberg laws or by talking about the concentration camps. And so just if for people to understand the methodology, I really wanted to tackle some of the bigger picture questions, because again, as important as it is, right, I am expecting some level of knowledge here. So if it seems like we're sort of jumping into the middle here, that's why. So I wanted to start off just by doing one text that I actually try to do a little bit of studying of every Yom HaShoah. And just to introduce it a little bit here, there's a rabbi, if people want to skim the sort of biography here, named Ephraim Oshry, who was a Lithuanian rabbi who was in his mid-20s when the Holocaust started. And he was sent through the ghettos and through the concentration camps. He spent years in a variety of concentration camps and eventually survived the Holocaust. And at the end, he became known for in the camps as an extremely knowledgeable rabbi who, of course, I mean, not that this even makes the list of the top 500 things that the Nazis did, but of course, there was no access to any Jewish information. And so for those subset of Jews that still, despite everything that was going on in the Holocaust, still wanted to practice Judaism, right? You had to basically seek out experts, right? Rabbis or other halachic deciders to figure out what to do. And so after the Holocaust, he subsequently moved to America, and he, from memory, wrote down a book or a compilation of all of the responsa, or at least the most important responsa that he engaged with during the Holocaust, and studying them shows a couple of things. I want to read one or two, and then I can kind of tell you why I'm spending time doing this, and also really what I think the lesson for us should be. And I can post this link into the chat later because we're not going to read all of them, but just I want to read one just to get us into the mindset of really talking about the horrors of the Holocaust, and then another to get us onto some educational framing. And so there was a question that was asked to him, and it goes as follows. On May 7th, 1942, the Germans issued an edict that if a Jewish woman was found pregnant, they would immediately kill her. Once this edict regarding pregnancy was issued, other problems came up. The very day the edict was issued, a pregnant Jewish woman passed by the ghetto hospital. A German noticed her swollen belly and shot her for violating the German order against reproduction. His bullet penetrated her head, and she fell dead on the spot. Passerbyers immediately carried her to the hospital, thinking there might be a chance to save her or the baby. Since she had clearly been in her final weeks of pregnancy, a Jewish obstetrician was rushed over. He said that if surgery was performed immediately, the baby could be saved. Since I had witnessed this shocking murder and was present in the hospital, I was asked if, according to Jewish law, it was permissible to perform the C-section. Since no one could be sure the baby was still alive, was there a Jewish legal concern with the desecration of the dead mother? In addition, in the remote possibility that the mother was still alive, cutting open her abdomen would surely kill her. And so just to get a sense, even from the question of the type of situations and the setting, not just that the Jews were in, one of the things that I always think about, especially with this specific question, and one of the things that I'm constantly amazed by, is how there was an attempt and there was still a focus of people that were in possibly the most hellish condition ever created on earth, to them still care about and worry about them following a legal and ethical code, that they were so concerned that if they did the wrong thing, perhaps they could hasten death a little bit for the woman. And just the compare and contrast of how these questions are formulated with how we know that the Jews and, of course, other minority groups in the Holocaust were treated. I mean, it really is night and day. And it's one of those things that is always stunning. And so the answer that Rabbi Oshry gives is as follows. It was clear to me that when a doctor who knows his medicine rushes to operate minutes after a woman's death, declaring that the baby can be saved, one must listen to him, because the issue at that moment is saving the baby's life. Where saving a life is involved, we are not concerned with the desecration of the dead. In this case, the mother would be overjoyed if desecration of her body meant that her baby's life would be spared. I therefore ruled that the operation proceed as quickly as possible. As it states in the Talmud, whoever saves a single Jewish life is credited with saving an entire world. The baby miraculously was alive. However, to our great sorrow, our hopes were soon shattered. The cruel murderers, with typical mad German punctiliousness for keeping records of the living and dead, soon entered the hospital to record the name of the murdered woman in their book of the dead. When they found the baby alive, their savage fury unleashed. One of the Germans grabbed the infant and cracked its skull against the wall of the hospital rooms. Woe unto the eyes that saw this. So of course, right, no words can really do justice to describe this. And really, it's one of those things that it's almost an impossibility. I mean, of course, Elie Wiesel, of course, and plenty of other survivors also try to write and try to help people that have never experienced anything like this understand what it was like. Of course, we all realize that is, of course, 100% impossible, right? No experience for somebody that wasn't actually there can do justice for understanding it. The best we can do is read firsthand accounts and listen to people who experienced it firsthand. And so it's why it's become sort of a tradition of mine to every Yom HaShoah, both for myself, do some learning, but also in every Yom HaShoah, I end up teaching about the Shoah, and I've used this type of resources because, again, it paints the vivid picture of the sadistic life that was happening, but also one of the issues and one of the, right, I want to talk about sort of big picture ways in which the Holocaust has been analyzed. There's sort of always this meta question that's going on where the Jews are oftentimes always painted as victims, right? Which is of course true. And when I say painted as victims, I'm not saying that they weren't victims, of course. But one of the other ways to view the Shoah, which is of course how many in the Jewish community have started doing it, is even in the most hellish of conditions, there was still an attempt by many of the Jews that were in the camps to not see themselves solely as victims, but still retain some amount of autonomy in terms of their identity, in terms of their morals, in terms of their worldview, in terms of what they might be able to accomplish. And it's these types of glimmers of hope that I think to some extent, right, we can read in virtually all of the firsthand accounts, and of course, how the Jewish community as a whole responded after the Holocaust. So I wanted to read one more here, and then we'll jump into a little bit of history. We can see if people have any comments, but this is really an incredible question. And so Rabbi Osher was asked another question. He said, during morning prayers, Rabbi Yosef recited the blessing, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, who has not made me a slave," right? One of the typical blessings in the morning. In the Reform liturgy, it is switched. So for those who are familiar with Reform liturgy, we say, "Blessed are you, God, who has made me free," right? But this is, of course, just the opposite. And this rabbi shouted bitterly to the master of all masters, "How can I recite the blessing of a free man? How can a hungry slave repeatedly abused and demeaned praise his creator by uttering, 'Who has not made me a slave'?" I was then asked for the Torah ruling on this question. Should the blessing be omitted because it seemed to be a travesty, in which case it would be forbidden to recite it, or was it forbidden to alter or skip any part of the prayer text established by our sages? And so again, even the type of questions that some were asking, right? We have a prayer thanking God for creating us free. Can we recite that under perhaps the least free conditions in world history? And the answer is as follows. One of the earliest commentators on the prayers point out that this blessing was formulated in order to praise God, not for our physical liberty, but rather for our spiritual liberty. I therefore ruled that we cannot skip or alter this blessing under any circumstance. On the contrary, despite our physical captivity, we are more obligated than ever to recite the blessing, to demonstrate to our enemies that even if physically we were slaves, as a people, we remained spiritually free. So in thinking about today's class here, one of the things that I think is sort of this meta question that's jumping around the Jewish community, and I would love to hear any and all input here, is this wider question of how do we understand the Holocaust in the contemporary, both Jewish and the American community? And this is something that, of course, there has been tons written on, right? Anywhere from questions in the public sphere in America namely, can anything be compared to the Holocaust? Is the Holocaust a thing of its own where we can never draw political comparisons? What are the chief lessons of the Holocaust, right? And this is something that again, right, there is a healthy spectrum of opinions. And one of the really interesting ways to actually study the study of the Holocaust, so we're staying meta for a second before we jump into the history, is actually by comparing different Holocaust museums. And it's something that I think at this point I've been to 7 or 8 different Holocaust museums. And it's really interesting the sociological or imperative angle that different museums give about the Holocaust. Because of course, if you go to, say, Yad Vashem in Israel, right, it of course does the same thing all Holocaust museums do, right? It tells the history, but there's an eye towards a redemption at the end, right? Even in terms of the architecture of Yad Vashem, right? It starts very wide, then it constricts in the middle at sort of the worst point, and then it opens up onto a beautiful view of Jerusalem, right? If one goes to the Holocaust Museum, say in Washington, D.C., right, interestingly enough, the entire museum is centered around the importance of it not happening again, not in a particularistic Jewish sense, but anywhere, right? The message that the DC Museum tries to drive home is, this is why liberal democracy is so important, because when it collapses, these are the type of things that can happen. And so even this wider question about what the Holocaust should be used for, what are the imperatives to be used for, and it really is one of those questions that I think the Jewish community has and is and will continue to ask ourselves, what are the chief lessons? Now, of course, it could be all of these things, right? I think a healthy disposition towards the Holocaust should be both a particularistic and a universal sense, mainly never again to the Jewish people, right? This is why, right, we can continue with the subtext. This is why it's so important for us to be politically engaged, for us to maybe have political autonomy in the form of Israel and Zionism, right? This is why all of those things are important. And then also in a universal sense, right? We know more than any other people, perhaps, how quickly a society can turn on its seeming weakest members. And one of the things that's constantly stunning, and one of the things that I actually will focus on today for maybe even longer than talking about the actual Holocaust, is just how fast that switch happened. I mean, it really was in the course of about 10 or 15 years that Germany went from being the best place for Jews in all of Europe, and really one of the best times in Jewish history to some extent in the early 1900s, to, of course, one of the worst times in history for any people. Even to the extent, I mean, just one of the things, and I think we might have even mentioned this text several weeks ago, but there were well-known Jewish thinkers, right? The one I'm thinking of now is Franz Rosenzweig, who was one of the most important Jewish philosophers of the 20th century. In, I believe it's the 19-teens or 1920s, somebody can fact check me there, he writes an essay, and his essay was his critique of Zionism, right? The exact setting is a little bit less important, but he talks about Germany as being a promised land for the Jews. He, in a sense, asks the question, he says, why are we wasting our time, right? I'm paraphrasing his argument here, building this, you know, nationalistic entity in the Middle East where there's nothing there and it's just a desert, and this is going to be a momentous project, right? Germany's already a great country. Why not put a little bit more of our resources into making Germany a little bit better? And then all of the messianism that our tradition talks about, we don't have to worry about a return to Israel. We can create utopia in Germany. And I quote this not to have, you know, bird's eye 2020 vision of, oh, look how foolish he was, right? It's almost the opposite. It's to some extent how quickly a society turned, that you go from all of basically the entirety of the community thinking that they're in a situation that can never turn, that is getting better, that, you know, the shackles of Jewish history and all the sorrow and lachrymosity are behind us, how quickly that society can turn on the deep end, and all of the important lessons to be drawn from that. So I wanted to do one more text in introduction here, and then we'll get into a little bit of the history. But I think it's important just to frame this in a number of ways, especially as I do suspect there is relatively high level of the historical literacy here. And that's from Hannah Arendt, who, just to give a short background, she was a political philosopher who was a Holocaust survivor, who was then the head reporter on the Eichmann trials, of course, the trials persecuting some of the worst members of the Nazis. And she wrote this famous report called On the Banality of Evil, which has become, to some extent, I'll be honest, it's become a very controversial book in the Jewish world and in the Israel world, because the argument that she makes is an argument that there was nothing uniquely evil about the Nazis, which to some extent is a very difficult argument to stomach, because the Nazis perpetuated what was certainly the most evil act ever perpetuated by humans. But her argument, it goes as follows, and she really developed this over the course of her study. And she says, the trouble with Eichmann, and this is, of course, after listening to months and months of all of the information that was coming out about the Holocaust, the Eichmann trials, just for those who aren't as familiar, was really the first time that the world stage got a firsthand glimpse of all of the atrocities. People, of course, knew throughout the 40s that something was happening and there were rumors, but this was the first time that anybody really documented it, and it was on the equivalent of sort of front page news throughout the Western world. And so she writes, the trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together. And so Hannah Arendt coins this term called the banality of evil, which has become, I think, quite an important term in political philosophy. But that term means we oftentimes have this view of evil, where evil is perpetuated by evil people. And there's this sort of stereotype of evil of these, I'm almost thinking of, comic books or superhero movies of these people sitting in layers that are just, all of their moral intuitions are tuned to the wrong direction. And we would just classify that person as fundamentally evil. And what she talks about is actually the majority of the Holocaust was perpetuated by normal people, right? To some extent by bureaucrats, who there were so many cogs in the system were always able to defer moral judgment. They were always able to say, what was I doing? All I was doing was I was in charge of the rail schedule. And other people said, well, what was I in charge of? All I was in charge of was ordering the Zyklon B. And, you can imagine it going down, and every single person making the claim that they are just one cog out of the wider, more complex system. And so the moral onus doesn't fall on them. And she makes this argument. And one of the things that's interesting about this argument is I went back and I reread Elie Wiesel's Night over this past weekend, just in preparation for Yom HaShoah and in preparation for this class. And certainly, if anybody here hasn't read it, it's definitely a must read. And he actually makes the seemingly same argument over and over again in his book, where he says that the scariest thing for him, right? He even writes at one point, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's pretty close to the exact wording. He said, to some extent, the victims I understood and the Nazis I understood. This is Elie Wiesel writing. What I couldn't understand is the people in the middle that just sat there as bystanders. Because to some extent, what he's saying obviously is not letting the Nazis off the hook, but what he's saying is, okay, there were some small percent of people who are motivated by a pernicious ideology that caused them to orchestrate systems that were terrible. But what's more terrifying for Hannah Arendt and for Elie Wiesel and for a lot of scholars of the Holocaust is how an entire society that were seemingly made up of good people, how they can fall into this pitfall. Ruth, go for it.
I just want to add something. The number of people who belonged to the Nazi Party was relatively small. You had to be accepted it was like joining a fraternity. He does say, and Joachim Prince said at the March on Washington, the greatest crime is silence. And he also said neighbor is not a geographic term, it's a moral concept. And all of those bystanders who did nothing, there were many more of them than there were of Nazis. And we should always remember that.
Yeah, Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, I have one of the, I mean, there's an estimate, I don't know where this estimate comes from, but they say that only about 10% of people at any given time in Germany or Poland or anything actually agreed with everything the Nazis were doing. That most of the people, if you were to ask them and they were to be honest, they would say, no, I actually find this whole system terrible. I just, for my safety.
But the Nazis, the Germans didn't even want to have, they let the Poles do their dirty work. They thought the Poles were Untermenschen just like the Jews were, but they were picky about who they wanted. Judges, they wanted doctors, they wanted educated people who unfortunately were all too willing to join.
Yeah, 100%. So just to give a little brief overview of the history, and of course, if anybody else has comments or anything to share, please do, is just taking a step back for the brief overview, just to talk about how, I mean, we've discussed a lot in this class before. We've spent a lot of time in medieval or even pre-modern and modern Europe, but just how rich of a history Jews had in wider Europe, in these countries where, again, Jews have lived for 1,000, 1,500, 1,600 years. And we can endlessly talk, as we did probably a couple months ago when we were talking about medieval anti-Semitism, about this sort of pan-ultimate historical question of scholars of anti-Semitism, which is how much did the cultivation and fomenting of medieval anti-Semitism, how much was that an enabler for the Holocaust? The answer is probably a lot. I mean, obviously scholars will differ in the exact amounts, but something like this doesn't happen overnight in terms of sentiment, right? And so one of the things that a lot of people study is it's not like Hitler was coming up with completely new ideas that nobody had ever thought about before, right? And we talked a lot, and for those who might have missed that class that are interested, several weeks ago we talked about the expulsion from Spain and medieval anti-Semitism, and a lot of sort of the sowing the seeds of anti-Semitism all throughout Europe. Then, of course, led to a situation where somebody can take power based off of these pernicious ideas. But as I said before at the outset, one of the scariest things, and this is actually also the way that the museum Yad Vashem begins, is to actually get a glimpse of how rich Jewish life was all throughout Europe before the Holocaust. And even pictures that are from the 1920s, even some from the 1930s, of families and camps and schools and synagogues, and the life and the picture that you get from what it looked like and what it actually was in all throughout Europe, Poland, Germany, all of these places where, of course, it wasn't equal in the same sense in which people enjoy equality in America today, but life was pretty great. I mean, it really was one of the better times in Jewish history to be all throughout Europe in the early 1900s. And so just to look at a couple pictures and just a glimpse at a world that was completely lost. And one of the, there's of course different frameworks that one can use to measure the magnitude of the Holocaust. And of course, nothing does it justice, right? The number 6 million is so big and so abstract that, right, it's almost impossible to fathom what 6 million is in any meaningful sense. When you count the number of communities and the number of subcultures and just the number of rich institutions that were built up by the Ashkenazi Jewish community, right? It's just another glimpse of what was destroyed, right? 6 million individuals were destroyed, but tens of thousands of communities, right? With the idea of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts, right? A community that created something, institutions, families, of course, also destroyed. And of course, life is extremely rich, right? Jewish life in Europe, and this is probably not news to anybody, but the Jews in Europe in the early 1900s were the most diverse group of people one can possibly imagine in terms of views about anything, right? You had some ultra-Orthodox Jews that were still living in shtetls. You had other completely atheistic Jews that wanted nothing to do with religion. You had some Jews that were staunch nationalists for whatever country they lived in. You had some Jews who were staunch communists and socialists and trying to start the revolution. You had Zionists, you had anti-Zionists, you had Reform, conservative, right? The number, right, this to some extent, aside from the 21st century in America and Israel, in the early 1900s in Europe, you probably had the widest array of Jewish ideological diversity in one place ever before in Jewish history. And the stunning thing is that, of course, they were all treated the exact same, right? It didn't make a difference which denomination one was, what synagogue one prayed at, whether one prayed to God 3 times a day, whether one didn't believe God existed, whether one attempted to convert out of Judaism, marry out of Judaism, right? All of these things. And so just looking at the array and diversity of Jewish life, again, is just another stunning way to view the tragedy that soon comes on. And so, of course, just to get a little bit more of the concrete history. So obviously World War I, without going too far into it, ends up being a disaster for the German nation. And Germany is an interesting place because there's always been sort of this latent nationalism of the German people, even from the Middle Ages, right? During the First Reich and then the Second Reich in the 1800s, right? At times at the height of, nobody would have called it nationalism in the Middle Ages, but the height of German power. And so you can imagine that for a lot of people that were staunch Germans, right? And interestingly enough, this actually also included many Jews who were staunch German nationalists. World War I was a huge slap in the face, especially with the Treaty of Versailles, and right, greatly limiting German power, creating, if you look at this map, this massive buffer and demilitarized zone that was basically taken from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and all of these contemporary nation states were created. And many Germans, right, felt that this was wrongfully taken from them and that this should be their land. And so there was a ubiquity of just despondency among the German people throughout the 1920s, and especially as time went on, right? One of the things that happened also as a result of World War I was economic collapse. And one of the reasons why I think it's important to talk about these factors, and one of the things that I'm specifically not doing, in case anybody is thinking that I'm doing this now, I don't think anybody is actually thinking that I'm doing this now, but I think it's important to mention anyway, is talking about sociological and political and historic factors that cultivate an identity or an ideology does not let that ideology or identity off the hook by saying, well, it was explained by these 3 or 4 different factors, right? Any effect in the world, right, has factors that caused it. And to some extent, what separates what we would call, right, in the most bland terms, good worldviews and good ideologies from bad worldviews and bad ideologies is not how they act when everything is going perfectly. In fact, it's the opposite, right? The only time that morality is actually judged is when things are going bad. How do you act, right? If everything's going perfect and I have no worries in the world, if I'm nice to people and if I'm a great person, right, I don't get a lot of moral brownie points for that, right? It's specifically at tough moments in life and in society and politics and culture where it's the real test of ideology. Because again, it's very easy when everything is going perfectly to be quote unquote good. And so, right, just as a framework here. And so you see just this map of inflation between the 1920s and then 1930s, where inflation, or sorry, this is a map of unemployment, where unemployment hits a high of 30%. And you really have a society that is economically in trouble. And then this next chart talks about just inflation in Germany. And you can see, compared to the US dollar, it goes from about 4 to, I think this is 4 billion, or maybe someone else can do the math, but basically worthless. And there are either, of course, these, stunning pictures of people burning, hundreds of German marks because the value was better valued if you use it for fire kindling than actually for money. And so you have a society that is in a lot of trouble. And this is, of course, meshing with a type of German nationalism that anyway thinks that the Germans have been wronged by the rest of the world, and really they should be this great empire, and they sort of have this, bullseye on their back, and they're being treated unfairly. And then this, of course, meshes in with that entire legacy of anti-Semitism. And so, right, it was multifactorial in terms of the rise of the Nazis, and what gave rise to this unique but pernicious movement was both the sort of raw ingredients for an uprising mixed with a people that anyway, for the past 16, 17, 1800 years in Europe were always scapegoated every time something went wrong. I mean, just think back to our discussion of medieval anti-Semitism, right? Every single time something went wrong, specifically in Europe, whether it was a child went missing or whether a new disease came across the town or whether, anything like that, right? The Jews were always the first one to be blamed. And so putting these dots together, right? It doesn't take a, genius academic or historian to connect that, well, they were looking for a scapegoat, right? Jews have been sort of the eternal scapegoat, and therefore this party began to rise, of course, led by Adolf Hitler, that was ripe and using anti-Semitism as their springboard to power. And so we get Hitler's rise to power, where the Nazi Party was born in 1920s, and this is anyway at a time when without getting too much into the details, German politics in general went over a major overhaul, which to some extent made it easier for Hitler to gain power. There was actually an attempt by Hitler in the early 1920s to sort of throw a coup to some extent, and it didn't work. And the fact that it didn't work is less scary than the fact that right after, his next attempt to gain power was to actually become a legitimate party and play by the rules of democracy. And so one of the most stunning things, I think, just reading about the history of Hitler and the history of the 19th Party for the 10 years before they actually gained power, was that everything they did to some extent was playing by the democratic rules. And it's a stunning thing to think about. And you can draw whatever imperatives and moral claims one wants from that, but it is really stunning to think that this wasn't a revolution in the same sense that, we think of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and that really was an overnight takeover of the government and of institutions and all of these things. The Nazis actually did it, and Hitler actually did it through spending several election cycles in the minority, right? Playing by the rules, giving speeches, amassing followers, developing his economic and always anti-Semitic theories. And then eventually, about 10 years later, he's appointed chancellor in 1933. And one of the things that happens immediately after he gains power is he starts to weaken the democratic norms. And so about a month after he's elected, there was a massive fire in one of the governmental institutions. And Hitler, of course, blames this fire on the Jewish communists and uses this as a pretense to weaken checks on power. And so even just thinking of democracies and how they collapse, right? Just because somebody gets elected through democratic norms, right? Democracy doesn't end once somebody gets elected, right? The process of checks of powers and all of these things, right? This really highlights just how important, and also to some extent, how scarily feeble a lot of democratic systems can be. When Hitler puts in this emergency decree just one day after the fire to basically say, all democratic norms out the window, we need to catch the perpetrators, they have no rights anymore. Oh, who are the perpetrators? Well, they must be the Jews. How do you know that? Well, because I know. Do they get any due process? No, because democratic norms are thrown out the window, right? You can see how this cycle works by you're just confirming your own pre-ideologies. And so nothing is actually being accomplished in any meaningful political or democratic sense. But this is the process of how democracies and democratic norms are weakened, right, through scapegoats, through capitalizing on turmoil and other events that inevitably come up. There's, right, then more events, right, for, right, Hitler, right, the Enabling Act was basically, again, more centralized power with Hitler. The Night of Long Knives was a night in which the SS, right, Hitler's private army, which eventually became the Nazi army, went through and eradicated any political opposition. And again, just how quickly this happened from what many historians will say was a free and fair election in the 1930s, just a year and a half later, Hitler's private henchmen, or the new army of Germany, is going through and killing all political opposition. So again, just how quickly this happens. And then Hitler, in one final act of consolidation, right, declares himself both the president and the chancellor, right, again, thereby making him the supreme leader, right? Nobody else has a say in anything that happens in Germany. And then, of course, one of the things that we know that Hitler immediately did is he immediately went and placed as many restrictions on Jews. And again, one of the things in which is again so scary is how systematic he did this. And it's something that's always shocking when you look through the history. And so just to read a quote from a who was a man who was a high school teacher at the time, who was interviewed after, and it was one of these questions about, like, basically, why didn't you do anything, right? Where were you when this was happening? And what he says is quite stunning, where he says, each step was so small, so inconsequential, so well explained, or on occasion regretted, that unless one were detached from the whole process from the beginning, unless one understood what the whole thing was in principle, what all these little measures that no patriotic German could resent must someday lead to, one no more saw it developing from day to day than a farmer in his field sees the corn growing. One day it is over his head. And so he describes this process where it's not that Hitler showed up and the next day the entire German economy and institutions were spent trying to ship Jews off into concentration camps. That whole process takes about 5 or 6 years. Again, still a very quick timeline. Of course, any timeline is quick for this, but just the step by step and almost, again, going back to Hannah Arendt, what's so to some extent scary about this is how bureaucratic all of these steps were, right? Which is almost, right, one of always the most stunning things is how systematic and bureaucratic the Nazis were, from anything from new laws to the running of camps to the taking of records, and all of these things. So, of course, in the 1930s, Hitler immediately starts a series of restrictions on Jews, right? Jewish shops all throughout Germany are boycotted. You can see a picture here, right outside of a Jewish store, basically saying, right, don't come in and buy from them, right? It is now illegal. They're Jewish. The Nazis, of course, started burning books, not just, right, of course, they started burning Jewish books, but really any book of any ideology that might challenge their Nazi ideology. And then probably the most important, at least from a historical point of view, the Nuremberg laws, which were eventually set into motion, and then the November decree basically explaining what the Nuremberg laws were. And so just to go into a little bit of the Nuremberg laws, because this is one of those historic things that I think are extremely important. So some of it is, again, it seems almost quote unquote small compared to everything else, but they changed the flag, right? So of course, right, if we're thinking of governmental takeover, right, perhaps the most governmental takeover thing somebody can do is actually saying the governmental flag no longer represents me, right? Here's this new flag, right? They change it to a swastika. Jews are, of course, now forbidden from any displays of nationalism. The citizenship law, where German citizenship is denied to Jews, and when, right, denied is almost the wrong word here, because many Jews had citizenship, so stripped away from Jews to some extent, and Jews are no longer citizens, but they are now subjects to the whim of the society, which is also to some extent, right, you ask how you convince a society full of perhaps mostly bystanders, right, to allow these norms that basically crumble all checks and balances and democratic norms. And one of the ways in which, again, the Nazis were very systematic at doing this, they basically said, no, don't worry, all citizens of Germany are going to keep their rights. It just so happens that X, Y, and Z people are no longer citizens. But if you were, and I'm going to, use air quotes here for this word just listening, if you are a good German citizen, well, don't worry, you have nothing to worry about, right? Don't get all up in arms, right? There's no reason to protest. There's no reason to sort of alert everybody, right? Everything is going well here. And of course, this goes with the stripping of all privileges. Jews were no longer able to vote, own property, own a business, be paid as wages.
You could take the Parmesan out.
And then just of course now eradicating any ability for Jews to interact socially with non-Jews, right? Forbidding intermarriages between Jews and Germans, the banning of employment in Jewish homes of any German female, because of course they were afraid that the races would mix, which again, from a legal theory to some extent, I'll go on a bit of a tangent here, but I think it'll be interesting and important in explaining why this is so important. Whenever a text reiterates a law multiple times, right? Let's even use the Torah as our example, right? If the Torah spends hundreds and hundreds of times telling people to not worship idols, what that tells historians is that at the time the Torah was written, there were a lot of people worshiping idols, right? If you have a legal text that goes over and over again and says not to do something, what that means historically is that plenty of people were doing it. And so what the Nuremberg laws say is that Jews were well integrated into German society, right? There were plenty of marriages between non-Jewish Germans and Jewish Germans. There was plenty of businesses owned by Jews. Jews were academics in the universities, right? Doctors, shop owners, right? This is not a situation, not that this would, again, change the ethics of it, but this is not a situation like it was in medieval Europe, where there was one small shtetl in the corner of town, and that's where all the Jews lived. And every time things would get tough, there would be a pogrom maybe, or some action against the Jewish community and maybe an expulsion, right? What the Nazis had to do in order to quote unquote find Jews, what was again, stunning and crazy. I mean, they poured over birth certificates and marriage documents, and they went to cemeteries, and they of course came up with all of these, now we would say comical, but really scary racial devices to try to measure noses and foreheads and all of these things. And they really thought that they can, to some extent, boil down racism to an anti-Semitism to a science. And one of the reasons why here, just one more important comment, I think this goes without saying, but again, just to delineate, for the purpose of the Holocaust, I really am using anti-Semitism and racism as interchangeable, even though in a wider sense, if somebody asked me to define anti-Semitism, I wouldn't talk about racism, but the Nazis really did view Jews, of course, as a race. And so one of the last important things, of the Nuremberg laws is the definition that the Nazis use, which by now is probably well known, is anybody with one Jewish grandparent. And so it didn't make a difference if that person believed in God. It didn't make a difference if that person was halakhically Jewish. It didn't make a difference if that person identified as Jewish, right? None of these things mattered except for having Jewish blood in you. And within Nazi ideology, that made somebody tainted. And so just fast forwarding, just so we hit the big historic events here, right? One of the big early turning points that, of course, much has been written about and everything like that is the Night of the Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. And to some extent, this has become the representative case of when things took a turn from legally, separating the Jews from the rest of society to now physically, in some way, hurting and even mass murdering Jews. Now, of course, there were Jews who were killed by Nazis before 1938, but this is really the first time that German society and the Nazis took a turn towards the sadism of viewing anti-Semitism as one of their chief goals throughout their power, as opposed to it being, okay, yes, let's sort of legislate the Jews out of existence right after Kristallnacht, right? There was a way of the Nazi leadership realizing, okay, we actually have society on our side here, right? We actually have the majority of society, or at least the people who are willing to speak up. They also want these anti-Semitic measures. And so perhaps in the early 1930s, you can imagine the Nazis trying to slowly introduce a lot of their more radical anti-Semitic measures. And all of a sudden, right, either they work or either they unleash the sort of latent anti-Semitism that was always prevalent, or an alternative reading of history is they realize that the 10% of people who are virulent anti-Semites would do whatever they wanted, and the 90% of people who might have actually had positive impressions of Jews wouldn't do anything to help, right? They would just be bystanders. That the Nazis realized, okay, we can actually take this to the next level. And all of a sudden, after Kristallnacht, right? Kristallnacht isn't so much so important for what happened that night, although what happened that night was, of course, terrible, right? Thousands of shops and homes destroyed and burned, and I think hundreds of Jews shot and killed, and this was the beginning of shipping some Jews out to the ghetto, right? Obviously, all of those things are terrible, but that to some extent was every single night between 1938 and the mid-1940s. What was important about Kristallnacht was this is the first time the Nazis realized they weren't introducing their anti-Semitic measures despite the populace and society, but it was with the help and with the support of the populace and society. And so, of course, this comes right before the German invasion of Poland. And so now you have this, you have the invasion of Poland, and of course, much has been written about how the Poles basically immediately surrendered, and actually about half the Jews that were killed in the Shoah were Polish, which is of course where the majority of concentration camps were, and the Polish people, of course, also harbored. They probably harbored even more anti-Semitic views than your average German, right? We discussed actually a couple weeks ago in our discussion of pre-modern Jewish history, anti-Semitic pogroms in Poland in the 1700s, especially, you know, huge pogroms that ended the Polish golden age of Jewry from about 1500 to the mid 1700s. And so they invade this community that, again, harbored anti-Semitic views. And you can immediately see, sorry if this is a little bit small, the systematic setting up of ghettos all throughout newly Nazi conquered lands. And so again, this is like another step in the separation of what the Nazis did, which is all of a sudden they did switch societies back to this sort of medieval type of way of Jewish living, where Jews weren't allowed to live in the big cities with everybody else. Jews had to live segregated into ghettos. Now, of course, the ghettos that the Nazis set up were far worse than the Italian ghettos or any of the other ghettos. The Italian ghettos weren't great either, but they weren't anything compared to the conditions of the ghettos that were throughout the Nazi Empire. And again, one of the really stunning things is, one, you could sort of read the accounts of a rough estimate of how many Jews were in each ghetto, but just this is also at a time, and this is of course one of the horrific and stunning things that comes across when you read accounts, is throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s, as violence against Jews became more commonplace on the streets, your average citizen that wasn't Jewish wasn't able to stomach it as much. And so the Nazis realized that what they were doing was, to some extent, so horrific that they couldn't keep doing it out in public. And so the idea to separate the Jews comes out of there, when they had the idea, okay, well, if your average person isn't maybe going to be able to stomach or support this systematic persecution, right, at least in a physical sense, right, let's make sure to move all of the Jews to another area so that these new areas, right, that new population doesn't have to stomach it. And Ruth writes in the comments, just to read your comment out loud, Ruth, that no ghetto or camps in Germany were to protect the German people. Jews were shipped east to Poland, where the Poles did the Nazis' dirty work. Exactly, and that ended up happening a lot. And as we mentioned before, most of the concentration camps, especially the worst concentration camps, were actually not in Germany, because again, of this stunning cognitive dissonance of your average German, right, didn't want to be complicit in what was going on, right? They wanted to ignore it, right? They wanted to, okay, there's vague rumors that the Nazis are doing this, but also we're reclaiming, you know, the German motherland. So, okay, we can push those rumors aside. Right, I'm being a little bit facetious here. So this enters into the Shoah. And one of the reasons why, you know, I of course today have been switching between calling it the Holocaust and the Shoah. Just a quick tangent on names. Shoah just means the disaster or catastrophe in Hebrew, and that's of course the preferred name of Israel. Right, tonight is Yom HaShoah, and tomorrow the Holocaust means burnt offering. And so, right, even within the names, right, and I'm not saying that one name is necessarily better than the other, but even the names of what we call this travesty, to some extent, highlight a different thing that is attempted to be gleaned from it to some extent, where a burnt offering to some extent has connotations of almost korbanot, right? Sacrifices that you imagine in the Torah. And one of the things that, is always fascinating and stunning is if you read translations of the Bible before the 1940s, whenever it talks about the korban olah, which now that we're reading through the book of Leviticus and our weekly parshiot comes across a lot, it's a burnt offering. These translations call it the Holocaust offering, right? Of course, no modern translation of any Jewish text would call it that, but just a brief couple of words. So just to go over some statistics here, just to show how quick this switch happened. So in mid-March 1942, 75 to 80% of all victims of the Holocaust were still alive, while 20 to 25% had perished. Merely 11 months later, in mid-February, the percentages were exactly the reverse. And so you have a rate, I did the math a couple years ago, but you have a rate of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people killed a day in the early 1940s by the Nazis. And again, just to account for all of the ways in which they did this, I mean, it's, none of these pictures, of course, are new to anybody. Just to go over a couple of them. This is, of course, the Zyklon B, the gas that they would use. This is a gas chamber. This was a picture from Auschwitz that was documented, where they would stuff hundreds and hundreds of people in, again, these small chambers, and of course, burn the bodies, because that was the fastest way to dispose of them. And even before this, they had the Einstein group and, right, these groups of sort of, I don't even know, I'll just say Nazi thugs, that were basically their entire job was to go around in these vehicles and kill as many Jews as possible. But even that wasn't quick enough. And actually, some of the theories as to why the Nazis pivoted was some of the people that were perpetuating that were getting themselves so nauseated with what they were doing that they weren't able to continue, which just shows, again, right, one of the reasons why I wanted to include the Hannah Arendt quote here is because the way that this was systematized and bureaucratized to some extent allowed a system like this to keep happening, because every single person, the Nazis were skilled organizers, right? They would ensure that every single step of this was enough disconnected that nobody had to think about it too much, right? You were not a person who was mass murdering the Jews. You were the person in charge of, when people got off the train, right, as put in this left picture, you were in charge of figuring out who are the strong, younger people that were able to work and help the Nazi war effort, and who were the weaker people that would go off to some other station, right? If you were the person at the next station, right, you weren't the person who was killing innocent children and elderly folks and, other people like that. You were in charge of collecting all of the important belongings of the, right, you can imagine so on there, right, and bureaucratizing the system so much that, right, the system itself is able to be perpetuated, even though almost any one of these people, if left to their own devices, wouldn't even be able to stomach what they were doing, even if they believed in it, right? That's the horrific part. And so just some other stories, again, hundreds and hundreds of accounts, right? One of the most famous is Babi Yar, but there's hundreds of others where groups of hundreds, if not thousands of Jews are led to the middle of a forest, told to dig their own grave and then shot on sight. And, this of course happens scores of times throughout the Holocaust. Just to read this one poem, because I've always found it really interesting, if not stunning and tragic, is scribbled onto the side of one of the cars that they found going to Auschwitz. They found this unfinished poem here. And it goes as follows: "Here in this carload, I am Eve with Abel, my son. If you see my other son, Cain, son of man, tell him I." And the poem ends there. And of course, it's a fascinating poem just to talk about, Jewish tradition for a second, where Cain and Abel were, of course, the first two set of brothers, right? They were the second generations of humans, and Abel was, of course, slaughtered by his brother Cain. And so this is sort of a play off the narrative in the 4th chapter of Genesis, right? The Cain and Abel narrative, right? But basically talking about how there's really no answer to some extent, right? One of the subtexts of the Cain and Abel story, just to go on a brief tangent of biblical interpretation, is the word Abel in Hebrew is Haval, right, or Hevel, right? That word is used in another book in the Torah, the book of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet, right? The book of Ecclesiastes starts off Hevel Havalim Hakol Haval, right? Or meaningless, everything is meaningless, or vanities of vanities, everything is vain, or right. And so to some extent, Genesis 4 is already playing on these words that a human murder, when Cain killed his brother Hevel, right? This is Haval, right? This is meaningless, right? There's no way to somehow explain what's going on, right? There's no rationale that would defend what it means for, an innocent man, Hevel or Abel, to be slain by his brother. And so this is such a beautiful and if not tragic poem, just again, to try to get a small glimpse of what was being thought about. And so by the end of it, and of course, one of the things that I of course know, and this goes without saying, is this does not even do this 2% justice. So this is not a fill-in for any systematic historical account or learning about the Holocaust. I mean, it's really a lifelong endeavor to some extent to truly try to understand what happened. And even after trying to understand, right, you maybe understand 1% of it. I mean, it's one of those things that, again, is still impossible to fathom. And I can read the accounts and I can look at pictures and I can read numbers and still to some extent, right, there's nothing to do it justice. And I'm reminded by this, there's a famous set of moral psychology research being done. And I say this as a very, to some extent, personal way in which, and one of the reasons why I think it's so hard to some extent for the average person to connect and to truly understand the magnitude of horrors. And the famous psychological experiment goes as follows. If somebody tells you that there is a little girl in trouble, let's say in Northern Africa right now, and you read a whole account of what's wrong with the girl, and maybe her family wants to kill her for X and Y reason, and somebody asks you, will you, and you know the girl's name, and you know exactly how old she is, and you know her goals for life, and then somebody asks, and they did this in several sets of psychological experiments, and somebody says, will you donate to help save, let's call her Sally? People will donate some certain amount. And then if you go to a second group and you ask them and you tell them there are 50,000 little girls living in this region of North Africa that are all being persecuted in some way because of X, Y, or Z, will you donate to help them? People are much less likely to donate in the second situation, right? And to some extent, this is, we can to some extent blame our moral psychology for this, right? The reasons what scholars give is that we evolved in small tribal groups where at most you would know 100 to 200 people. And so our minds did not evolve to understand the magnitude of what it means when we hear these raw numbers of hundreds of thousands, millions, right? What does it mean that there are hundreds of millions of people today that don't have access to food or electricity or all these things? And to some extent, I think this is the problem that educators of the Holocaust run up against, because anybody can quote the number 6 million, right? It's sort of, the first thing, right? If somebody says Holocaust, immediately my mind goes to 6 million, but actually understanding what that means, right? That's a whole different situation, which is, again, getting back to the original point, right? It's why firsthand accounts, if not in person, right, recordings or literature, all these things are so important, because all of a sudden it doesn't go from this sense of this massive tragedy of millions of people. It goes from someone you knew, or someone your friend knows, or somebody your parents knew, or your parents, or your grandparents, or your great-grandparents. And so it's so important. And so just to again go over some of the numbers and the rates of survival from some of the worst camps, right? You can obviously contrast the numbers to the people who survived in the conditions. Just to read one other quote from Elie Wiesel here that always stuck out to me. He says, right when he got off, right, he was in his mid-teens at this point, and he got off the train at Auschwitz, and he said, around us, everyone was weeping. Someone began to recite the Kaddish, the prayer for the dead. I don't know if it has ever happened before in the long history of the Jews that people have recited the prayer for the dead for themselves. And it just gives you, again, hopefully a tiny glimpse of the situation there and the horrors. And so we go to the aftermath, and one of the things in which the Nazis did, just one last, part of the sadistic, ideology to some extent is, and this is something that a lot of scholars have noted before, at a certain point, as the Nazis were, losing World War II, again, we didn't talk much about World War II, but I'm assuming some basic knowledge, right? Eventually, Italy joins in, Japan joins in, right? Eventually, America joins in after Pearl Harbor, right? Things start to turn in the mid-1940s, right? Or the early 1940s, it's clear the Nazis are losing. And rather than, say, divert economic resources away from the concentration camps, the Nazis basically doubled down. To the point where, there are a lot of military historians that suggest that the Nazis might have at least stalemated the war to some extent if they would have given up on the Holocaust, and they would have just diverted all of these resources to the war efforts. And so one of the things that they did as liberation was happening, I mean, this is how vile the ideology was. As liberation was happening, they would basically take the inmates on what we now know as death marches, but just walking as far away from the liberators as possible. If to say, let's try to buy 3 more days in hopes that, we can get, hundreds of more Jews to die on this march, where of course they're not being fed and they're not stopping. And it was, especially in the winter time, right? It's freezing cold, right? These horrific accounts. And so just how all encompassing and paralyzing to some extent, this ideology was. And so we go to, one final graphic just to show both how many Jews were killed in which country and what percentage of that Jewish community was killed. And again, right, we said Poland had about half the victims, right, almost 3 million, right, almost 90% of the Polish Jewish community was wiped out. And again, this is a rich historic Jewish community, right? It's the same thing for Hungary and Lithuania, right? Again, right, for one to study early modern Jewish history, and we discussed a little bit of pre-modern Jewish history, but for one to really steep themselves in it, it really is the story of Lithuanian yeshivot and Polish yeshivot, right? Jewish study halls, right? This is where the Haskalah happened, right? This is where this is where the Zionist movement happened, right? These were the centers of Jewish life, and overnight, right? It's not just the individuals that died, it's entire ways of life and entire communities that now, the remnants of some of them have made it overseas, either to Israel or America, but entire ways of life have been virtually wiped out. And there's almost been, to some extent, a disconnect. And this is something that I think, I wouldn't mention this if this was a primarily, wider audience, but I think, within a primarily, Jewishly knowledgeable and Jewish audience, I think it's important to mention, right, this represents a major turning point in really how, Jewish identity and how the community sees itself, and to some extent, even a disconnect of community. I mean, you think of community as going seamlessly from one generation to another with, obviously some innovations and some changes, but you expect, in the wide bird's eye of history, there to be, some slow linear progress every once in a while, maybe a big jump or innovation, and, a community having to pivot. Ashkenazi Jewry 2 generations or 3 generations ago went through just a major shift and a major change in ways that, there's endless scholarship on, but in ways that have drastically affected Jewish life and the Jewish community. I mean, there are some modern Jewish thinkers that make the argument that there is, in the Ashkenazi community, no type of Judaism that is practiced today can be called traditional Judaism. It can only be called post-Holocaust Judaism. That's true whether you're talking about ultra-Orthodox, modern Orthodox, conservative, Reform, secular, right? Just this is the total and all-encompassing effect that this had on the Jewish people. And just in the last minute, just to bring up this this graphic before, where I think, I mean, one of the imperatives really is whether this is an imperative of always making sure not to be the bystanders, or realizing to some extent that there always will be bystanders, again, between this particularistic and universalistic approach, right? Which I think it's healthy to absorb both of them, both as a distinct particularistic lesson for the Jewish people of this is, right? I certainly am not predicting, nor do I think, something like this will happen again, but it certainly can happen again, right? Which I think is an important thing to always keep in mind, right? And on the other hand, also, just as it happened to us, it also can happen to other people. I know that it is 6:57, and I know that the service starts in about 2 minutes. But if anybody has any thoughts or questions, or just wants to say anything just before the service here, feel free to unmute. And if not, I will see you all next week. We are not going to be meeting on Monday. We're going to be meeting on Thursday, and I'll send out a reminder email and all of that. And I'm wishing you all a meaningful Yom HaShoah.
Thank you, Daniel. That was incredible. Thank you.
I think he's in.
Thank you very much.